A single drop of sweat hit the red-hot iron with a sharp hiss. But Cale did not move his hand. Inside his cramped workshop, the air tasted of sulfur and crushed coal, thick enough to cling to the back of his throat. He leaned over his workbench, where dozens of delicate silver rings and crystal-encrusted brooches lay arranged in neat, silent rows. Every piece was tailored for the noble ladies who walked the polished marble halls of the upper district. Yet Cale's own thumbs were stained with black oil and cracked at the joints from hours of ceaseless filing. Outside, the heavy iron carriage wheels of his creditors rattled over the cobblestones, a daily sound that made his stomach twist into a cold knot. He picked up a pair of brass tweezers, trying to set a tiny blue sapphire into a pendant, but his fingers trembled just enough to send the stone skittering across the dust-covered floor. He fell to his knees, scraping his fingernails against the rough pine boards, searching for a gem worth more than 6 months of his unpaid shop rent. His breath came fast and shallow, smelling of stale bread and cold tea, as he realized that no matter how many hours he hammered, polished, or mended, the ledger on his desk only grew heavier with red ink. The velvet lining inside his display cases was fading from rich crimson to a dull, sun-bleached pink, mirroring the slow drain of energy from his own chest. As the church bell struck 5, heavy footsteps halted directly outside his reinforced wooden door, followed by 3 loud, measured knocks that vibrated through the floorboards beneath his knees. The iron latch gave way as 2 deck collectors pushed through the doorway, smelling of damp wool and stale tobacco, their heavy boots leaving gray slush on the clean workshop floor. Without a word, the taller man swept his arm across the glass display cabinet, sending a dozen silver brooches crashing onto the hearth, where orange embers swallowed the velvet trays in a burst of black smoke. Cale lunged forward, grabbing a heavy brass candelabra to block the fireplace. But the second man seized his workbench, tipping a month of delicate filigree work into the flames. Heat surged against Cale's face, scorching the hair on his forearms, while the acrid smell of burning polish filled the small room like a wall of ash. Outside the window, Clara stood on the cobblestone street under the flickering gaslight, her suitcase packed at her feet, refusing to look up as she boarded a passing carriage that carried her away into the rain. The fire spread rapidly, devouring the dry pine rafters until the roof beam groaned and cracked overhead, forcing Cale to stumble out into the icy alley with nothing but ash smeared across his cheeks. He sat on the wet stone curb, listening to the crackle of his livelihood turning to charcoal, his chest tight as if bound by iron bands. Every coin he had saved was reduced to gray dust blowing down the gutter, leaving his hands completely empty. He reached into his leather apron pocket, searching for his silver magnifying lens, but his fingers found only a handful of cold cinders. Through the thick smoke drifting down the deserted street, an old man carrying a carved walking stick emerged from the darkness and stopped directly in front of him. The old man's olive wood staff tapped sharply against the wet asphalt, breaking the hiss of the dying embers behind Cale. Without waiting for an invitation, the stranger reached out with a hand calloused by hard labor and dropped a heavy brass coin directly onto Cale's scorched palm, the cold metal biting against his burned skin. Cale jerked his hand away, his fingers curling into a tight fist as the sharp edges of the coin dug into his flesh. Staring up at the stranger's weather-beaten face illuminated by the flickering street lamp. "Take your coin and your pity elsewhere, old man," Cale spat out, his voice cracking against the raw chill of the night air as he stood up and shoved past him toward the alley exit. The stranger did not move, his patched wool coat rustling in the wind as he spoke into the darkness with a steady, unyielding calm. "You can burn the workbench, Cale, but you cannot burn the hands that built it, unless you choose to stay down in the ash." Cale froze, his boots planted in the freezing slush, his chest heaving as the scent of wet soot filled his lungs. He spun around, slamming his fist against the damp brick wall until his knuckles throbbed with a dull, stinging pain. The stranger stepped closer, the smell of aged cedar and rain wrapping around him like a physical barrier, and leaned his weight on his staff. "I am Amen, and I have walked through fires worse than the one behind you," the old man said, his eyes catching the amber glow of the street lamp like twin points of hard light. Cale's jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. every muscle in his arms tensing as he looked at the man who offered no sympathy. Only a stubborn, uninvited presence. If you think a coin can buy my pride, you're wrong, Cale said through gritted teeth. Stepping directly into Amon's personal space with his chest heaving, Amon met his gaze without flinching, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate tone that cut through the howling wind. I am not offering you charity to rebuild your shop, Kyle. I am giving you a mandatory choice tonight. Either sit here in the mud and let the cold finish what the fire started, or walk with me to the old well and learn the daily practice that turns every closed door into an open road. Amon led Cale through the narrow alleyways to the village well, where the icy wind smelled of moss and damp stone. Standing beside the ancient granite basin, Amon rolled up his left wool sleeve, revealing a deep, jagged scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow, pale against his weathered skin. 30 years ago, I commanded 3 trading ships loaded with silk and spice, Amon whispered, his warm breath vaporizing into white mist in the freezing night air. A autumn gale dragged every hull to the ocean floor in 20 minutes, taking my life savings and leaving me broke in a foreign port. Kyle watched the old man's scarred arm tremble slightly as Amon pressed his palm against the rough, cold well head. I cursed the sea for 7 years, sleeping in horse stables until I realized that losing those ships forced me onto a dusty mountain trail where I met the master who taught me gemstone cutting. Amon continued, his voice steady as a heartbeat. The wreck was not my ruin, it was the redirection that saved my spirit. Cale stared at his own soot-covered palms, feeling the sharp sting of fresh blisters while the heavy scent of burning wood still lingered in his clothes. Easy for you to say now, Cale muttered, pulling his leather apron tighter around his shivering chest. You survived your storm. Amon turned, his dark eyes fixing on Cale with fierce intensity as he held out a smooth, flag-gray stone from his coat pocket. The habit is simple, Cale. Every single evening, no matter how bitter the loss, you must touch this stone and speak aloud 3 words. There is a reason, until your mind stops fighting the storm and starts looking for the hidden open doorway. Cale hesitated, his jaw tight, before snatching the smooth stone from Amon's grip and shoving it deep into his pocket, his knuckles turning white as he made a firm decision to test the old man's radical claim starting at sunrise. By noon the next day, the winter sun hung low like a dull brass plate over the frost-covered valley. Cale stood in the cramped back room of an abandoned grain shed, his cold fingers trembling around the smooth gray stone in his apron pocket as he pulled a contract from his leather satchel. Across a makeshift timber table sat Vane, the rival merchant who had once outbid Cale for royal supplies, smelling of clove tea and damp beaver fur. Pawnee brass filigree lockets by sunset on Friday. Cale, or I reclaim this shed and take your remaining hand tools for dead default, Vane said, slapping a pouch containing 50 silver pieces onto the scarred oak planks. Cale swallowed the bitter taste of ash still lingering in his throat, gripping the gray stone until its hard edge dug into his palm before looking Vane dead in the eye. Accepted, Cale answered, taking the heavy quill and signing his name in bold black ink, putting his entire craft on the line. For 3 days, the workshop hummed with the screech of steel files and the hiss of soldering irons under the flickering yellow glow of tallow candles. Cale's knuckles bled under the wire mesh, but each time exhaustion threatened to paralyze his arms, he touched the stone in his pocket and whispered, "There is a reason." On Friday morning, 2 hours before the deadline, a royal courier spurred his lathered bay horse through the mud, banging on the shed door with a brass-tipped riding crop. "Cancel all silver orders," the courier shouted, his coat reeking of sweat and wet leather. "The Duke's daughter has fallen ill with lung fever. The winter gala is dissolved." Cale's hands froze over the final polished locket. The 50 silver coins vanished from his table as Vane stepped inside with 2 armed bailiffs, declaring the agreement breached and ordering Cale's immediate eviction into the freezing street. The bailiff shoved Cale into the freezing alley, slamming the heavy pine door behind him as snow began to dust the cobbled street. He sat on an upturned wooden crate near the frozen riverbank, his fingertips numb, holding the smooth gray stone against his blood-stained apron. The sharp smell of wet slate and pine needles filled the biting air while the cancelled lockets rattled in his satchel like useless gravel. Cale forced his shaking hand to close around the stone, pressing its flat surface against his chest until the cold rock warmed against his skin. "I do not see it yet," he whispered into the swirling wind, his breath forming a dense white plume. "But there is a reason for this shut door." With the commercial order cancelled and no shop to maintain, his hours stretched wide open. He pulled a small iron crucible from his satchel, gathered leftover brass shavings and crushed river slate, and built a small fire beneath a stone overhang. For 3 days, free from the pressure of Vane's deadline, he experimented with mixing ground mineral ores into molten metal, searching for a new alloy. On the 4th morning, he poured the glowing liquid into a clay mold, letting it cool in the icy river water. When he cracked the ceramic casing away, the metal shone not with ordinary yellow brass, but with a deep, midnight blue sheen that reflected light like polished sapphire. Cale held the gleaming pendant up to the weak winter sun, realizing the cancelled contract had given him the exact and scheduled hours needed to discover a metal refinement no artisan in the province had ever achieved. Taking his single blue metal pendant, he marched directly into the central square, stepping onto the marble stairs of the merchant hall where Vane stood addressing the guild leaders. The cold morning sun struck the marble steps of the hall as Cale stepped into the center of the crowded square, his leather boots leaving dark tracks in the melting slush. Vane stood at the top of the terrace, surrounded by wealthy guildmasters smelling of lavender soap and roasted chestnuts, boasting of his newfound workshop monopoly. Without uttering a word of complaint, Cale reached into his satchel, drew out the midnight blue metal pendant, and unclasped its chain, holding it high so the harsh winter light caught every facet of the iridescent alloy. A collective whisper rippled through the gathering as 3 senior guildmasters pushed past Vane to examine the deep sapphire sheen that outshone every standard silver piece on display. Vane's face turned pale under his fur collar, his hands fidgeting with his velvet pouch as he stepped forward to claim the metal belonged to his shop's inventory. Cale stood his ground, resting his thumb against the smooth gray stone resting inside his pocket. Feeling its reassuring weight against his thigh, this alloy was berthed in an open iron crucible by the river. "After your bailiffs locked my former doors," Cale declared, his voice echoing across the stone plaza like a striking hammer, the chief guild inspector took the pendant, testing its hardness against a steel file, and immediately offered Cale a commission of 300 gold eagles for exclusive supply rights to the province's upper houses. Cale accepted on the spot, using his first advance payment to buy back his original tools. But before he could leave the plaza, a desperate man in ragged clothes grabbed his arm, begging for help. Cale turned to see Vane kneeling in the slush, his fine wool coat stained with mud and his hands trembling violently. The guild council had stripped Vane of his trading license following his fraudulent claims, leaving the disgraced merchant broke and facing heavy municipal debts. "I have no workshop, no silver, and 3 young children to feed," Vane confessed, his breath smelling of stale wine as tears tracked through the soot on his cheeks. "Do what you want with me, Cale." Cale reached into his pocket, his fingers wrapping around the smooth gray stone that Eamon had given him by the well, feeling its cool surface radiating a quiet strength. Instead of turning his back or demanding retribution, Cale pulled Vane up by his arms, setting a heavy leather pouch of silver coins directly into the man's trembling hands. "I am not here to crush you, Vane," Cale said, his voice ringing steady against the marble pillars of the hall. "I am hiring you to manage my supply transport." Vane stared at the silver pouch in disbelief, wiping his damp eyes as the crowd watched in silent awe. Cale led Vane to a flat granite rock beneath an oak tree near the river, where he reached into his pocket and handed him a second smooth gray stone. "When every door slams shut and you feel completely paralyzed, grip this rock every evening and speak 3 words until your mind begins to look for the hidden way forward. There is a reason." Cale instructed. Vane pressed the stone against his chest, nodding slowly as the first ray of hope cleared the shadow from his face, proving that the simple practice could awaken courage in even the most broken soul. 5 years later, the scent of lavender oil and pine sawdust drifted through Cale's sprawling forge near the river, where 12 young apprentices hammered midnight blue alloy into gleaming royal regalia. High on the grassy knoll overlooking the valley, the flat granite stone where Cale once sat in despair had become a quiet sanctuary. smoothed by hundreds of hands seeking strength. Every evening, as the horizon turned peach and gold, Cale walked up the hill, carrying a small leather pouch filled with smooth river rocks to leave for weary travelers. On this sunset, an old man with an olive wood staff sat waiting on the granite bench, his patched coat worn thin by years of dust, watching the river reflect the fading orange sky. Eamon smiled, his dark eyes glowing as Cale sat beside him and set two polished blue pendants onto the cool stone between them. "The fire burned away my timber, Eamon," Cale said, his voice deep and calm, "but it forged a courage that no setback can ever shatter." Eamon nodded slowly, placing his scarred palm over Cale's hand, feeling the steady, unyielding pulse of a man who was no longer trapped by closed doors. Below them, Vane walked out of the storehouse with a ledger in hand, teaching an apprentice how to find opportunity in a ruined order. While the village bell chimed soft and clear through the twilight air, Cale picked up his original gray stone, rubbing its smooth edge between his thumb and forefinger, knowing that the daily practice had not merely restored his fortune, but had awakened an unshakable strength that transformed every broken dream into a permanent bridge forward.